check the mic?
Testing, testing.
Yeah.
Hello?
I think he didn't turn the volume all the way up, but just to see if it's
Testing, testing,
testing.
testing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good evening. I was asked by my colleague Olani Ewunnet to say hello. And exactly. Welcome to Savvy Contemporary. It's a great pleasure to have all of you around. It's always a great pleasure to see new faces. And I really tell you, I've seen a lot of new faces today. It's a great pleasure to have Lesley-Ann Brown with us. She sent us a message a few weeks ago saying, oh, I have this new book out. Why don't we do something at Savvy? And you cannot say no to such an offer. And we're really happy that she's there to share with us this book. I won't say anything about the book because I haven't read it. And I think the conversation is about to come. But I just wanted to say, put your hands in your pocket, take out some money, buy the book, and read it. But I wanted to say one or two words about Savvy Contemporary, because if you ask me to say hello, that's what I do. Savvy Contemporary is made up of some 25 people that work here and that happen to come from different parts of the world and happen to find themselves in this space called Berlin and want to reflect on the realities of this space, especially looking at the world through the prism of the South. That is what we try to do. We do exhibitions. Does somebody need some water? So we do exhibitions, we do a lot of performances. We'd like to try to think through the body. We do readings. It's a discursive space. Since some of you are new here, I would like you to drop in your names and maybe your email addresses and stay in touch with us so that you just get to know what we do and how we do it. It's always a challenge to do a kind of a space like this that has little or no funding from the state, but that thinks of itself as the space to tackle issues historically, socially, economically, like you see in the exhibition we have right now called Geographies of Imagination, where we try to think about processes of disothering, on how to not let ourselves be put in the boxes of the other, how to engage in processes of disothering. It's a pleasure to have you here. Stay on. After the talk, we have a bar, and it's a really good one. Stay there, drink some wine, because that is our source of income. It's one of the few places where getting drunk is a positive thing. So stay on and do that, and just engage with us in the conversation. So once more, thanks for coming, and also thank you, Olani, for accepting to do this conversation. And thanks to the many Savvy people, some in the background, some in the foreground, that make this happen and that have been working in this space, some of them for 9 years. So even if you don't come to Savvy in the next month, don't miss the 10th anniversary next year, because it's going to be a blast. Thank you all.
Hey, y'all. It's my honor to be hosting this reading and to welcome Lesley-Ann to Berlin. Before I give you guys the formal bio, I just want to give a bit the backstory of how I first became familiar with your work. It was the summer of 2015. I was studying in Copenhagen, and I hadn't met a single black person. And then I was doing a bit of internet research, and I came across Lesley-Ann's blog, Black Girl on Mars, and that kind of put me on the right track to meet some black folks in Copenhagen. And it's an honor to have you in Berlin now on the occasion of the launch of your latest book. And now I'll do the formal bio, and then we're going to get into 3 of the letters from the book. So Lesley-Ann Brown is a Tribongian American who currently resides in Copenhagen, Denmark. Brown was born in Brooklyn, New York, and has lived on the Twin Island nation of Trinidad and Tobago. She studied writing at Eugene Lang College, part of the New School for Social Research. During the golden age of hip-hop, Brown honed her writing skills at Vibe magazine and The Source, interviewing various hip-hop artists, writers, poets, and visual artists. In 2007, she created the critically acclaimed blog, Black Girl on Mars, and founded Bandit Queen Press. Her memoir, Decolonial Daughter, Letters from a Black Woman to Her European Son, published with Repeater Books in London 2018, covers many themes, including motherhood, environmentalism, the prison industrial complex, racial violence, the violent legacy of silence, spiritual healing, and the normalization of white supremacy here in Europe and other Western countries, to name a few. So, Lesley-Ann, welcome, and I want to just invite you all to give her a warm welcome as well.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here, Savvy, and Olani for doing such a great preparation for our talk tonight. Thank you.
So let's maybe we just get into the first letter, country,
Yes.
a map to liberation.
Yes, let's do that. So, as mentioned, this is a book of letters to my son, and so each part that I read is actually part of a letter, so you can get some sort of context. The title of the book, Decolonial, just sort of means an approach that I take to history and my life. And one of the practices that I think has been decolonial for me is thinking about a higher power in terms of a female energy. So I'm going to read you Country, the Map to Liberation, which I begin with an indigenous prayer. And the prayer is, "O great grandmother spirit, give us your peace so we can love as you love us. Make us healthy so we can have a good life. We praise you, O great grandmother spirit." And then I go into a quote by Hamlet, which is, "The undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns." And I just ask you to repeat after me, country. 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 Thank you. And then I ask, what country are you from? And again, country. 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 And then I gotta ask, what country are you from? So country is a noun, and some of the definitions, because there are a few, include a nation with its own government, districts and small settlements outside large towns, and also an area or region with regard to its physical features. It's Middle English that originates from Old French, country, from medieval Latin, contrata, terra, meaning land lying opposite, from Latin contra, which is against and opposite. So again, country. 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 And then I ask, what country are you from? And then I take the word and I say country. And I should actually say this poem was actually, it was born here in Berlin. I was in conversation with the Black consciousness, South African Black consciousness scholar and artist, Simi Dali, and we were sitting here in Berlin having a conversation about country. So this poem that I'm reading is actually born here in this city and inspired very much. Of a tree. tree are you from? What tree of cunts do you descend from? What is your maternal lineage? Who are the women who came before you? What are their names that you cannot remember, or perhaps you do? Stitch your lineage back together again. Who is the woman through whose body you passed, between the unseen to the seen? And who was the woman through whom she passed, and over again, all the way back? All the way back until she is free. And if you do not know, how does that play into perpetuating the powers that be? How does it play in strengthening patriarchy? Why is it that the mother has been othered? And what I'm about to say is very much directed towards all the mothers who have lost their children through wars that we like to participate in. I think of the children whose mothers were raped. I think of the women whose lives are not valued. Who are the women who came before you? What are their stories? What are their names? Say their names. Smash patriarchy with their names. Cunt trees have no borders. Cunt trees have no flags. Cunt trees have no military. Cunt trees have no visas. Cunt trees have no passports. From cunt trees we do not flee. They are in our blood. What is your cunt tree? So the next time someone asks you, what cunt tree are you from? Start with the name of your mother and your mother's mother. And if you should not know them, name the name of the women who have mothered you. And if you are without that, invent them from the very fabric of mythology that have come before you, so that in your utterance, they become real and present. I believe it is in the answering of this question that paves the road to liberation. I am the daughter of Beryl Balbier Singh. She's the daughter of Hildred Charles, and Hildred Charles is the daughter of Francis Lopez, who is the daughter of Rose Lopez. And then I rewrite Hamlet, because why not? The undiscovered country from whose bourne all travelers return. And then I end my letter to my son. In an attempt to do what those before could not do for me, I hope that by through fact and conjecture, share this in
the following literary trajectory that you're kind of continuing. As a reader, I felt the connections with Audre Lorde's Manchild, Baldwin's Time, and Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me. You know, that kind of structural critique, historically grounded, with the entry point of a parent to child, letting your child know like what is coming. And you dedicate one of your letters to Baldwin. It's titled On Baldwin. So I thought maybe you could tell us a little bit about Baldwin's influence on your work.
Yes, Baldwin his work is still very relevant today. As a black gay man writing when he was writing, and I discovered him, I was around 12 years old, and I was very fascinated by who he looked. And it resonated a lot with me because I've been thinking about certain issues ever since I was a child. These issues that I address in my book, I could actually trace it back to my childhood, wanting to understand why the world is the way that it is, why my family lineage, why my family was experiencing what it was experiencing, why people around me, et cetera. I really wanted to have a historical understanding. And Baldwin just did the work. In terms of, I don't think there's anything anyone can do. If people read Baldwin today, which we do, but if more people read Baldwin and really listened to what he said, there would be no need for more letters or more. He was a very precise and very conscientious and very, very politically conscious writer. And for me, I never had the luxury of separating politics from my writing. or I wouldn't even call it a luxury, and he just really modeled for me what it means to be using the craft as a source of integrity and also a way of paving the way towards liberation, because there is a tradition of using the whole academic tradition in terms of liberating oneself. So.
And also the parallel of movement, right, from the States,
Right.
that New York to Copenhagen. I was feeling like what Baldwin is to Paris, you are to Copenhagen, kind of. This, Baldwin, when he was asked about why he moved to Paris, like what he loved about France, it was like a 1983 interview with Paris Review. He said, well, it was less about France, it's actually about leaving America. Right. And I wanted to hear your thoughts on the move from New York to Copenhagen, what that was like.
Well, one of the things I've been really thinking about lately is the fact that I do live in Europe, and my whole relationship to it and my understanding of Europe, what's going on in the world. So I've been really interrogating myself about that a lot lately. And what I realize is that when I was quite young and I read Baldwin, I was imprinted with a program of the black writer moving to Europe. So I knew at a quite early age that I wanted to move to Europe, and I didn't really understand why. I just like, oh, that's what you do when you're an artist. And but I've been in Denmark for 19 years, and witnessing and experience what I've experienced, I'm at a particular point right now where I'm just really like, okay, where should I be in terms of is Europe, I feel like I've done what I came to Europe to do. But yeah, I mean, for me, it was very much escaping New York, absolutely. And being in a position where the violence wasn't so palatable.
I wanted to, while we're on the topic of black women in urban contexts, framing from with the entry point of Baldwin, in his letter to his nephew, The Fire Next Time, he ends the letter. He's talking about 100 years. Our country was written in 1963, 100 years after Emancipation Proclamation and all these big events in the United States. He says we're celebrating 100 years too soon. Right. With love, your Uncle James. And then I'm thinking of the Denmark, 100-year anniversary in 2017 of selling of the Virgin Islands for $25 million US. Could you tell us about Denmark's first public monument to a black woman and how that relates to that whole situation?
Sure. Well, there's a statue, a very large statue that's on Copenhagen Harbor, a very major one called I Am Queen Mary statue. How many of you have heard about it? Yeah. And it was done by the artist Jeanette Ehlers and a Crucian artist called Yvonne Bell. And I actually knew Jeanette when I've known her for many years now, and I knew her when she had this idea to do this very large statue of Queen Mary, who was she was someone who led a labor revolt I believe on the island of St. Thomas to rebel against the fact that people of African descent were not getting the same wages as people of European descent. So they basically burned the whole island, or the main the capital city down, and she led it, and they imprisoned her and 3 other queens, actually in Copenhagen. It's quite an interesting story, and Jeanette, she did it. All of a sudden, a few years later, there's this. You're seeing 3D sketches or computerized stuff, and she's working with this, like I said, this Crucian artist, and next thing you know, we're all standing there on the harbor, and they're unveiling this, and there's all these people. So it was actually, it's quite a success. The reaction to it has been very interesting. I teach in Copenhagen, And in May, I took my class for a canal boat ride. And we were going along the harbor that the statue is in. And the statue is right next to, it's a big warehouse, which used to be where they stored all of the colonial wares. So on one side of that, there's this big statue of David. And Jeanette's whole idea from the beginning was to counterbalance this very white male statue with Queen Mary, which he does. So he's on one side of the building, flanking it, and then this I Am Queen Mary, which is the same size, yeah? So I'm on this canal boat ride, and we pass it, and the tour guide says nothing about the I Am Queen Mary statue. And everyone on the boat was just like, well, what's that? What's that, right? It was really interesting. I mean, she didn't know what my relationship was. She doesn't know that I know the artist or that that I'm a writer, or it was just so really interesting to see. And it was so, the silence and the gap was just so loud. So when we got back, when she came back to the harbor, I asked her, I was like, hey, how could you, that's a big omission. I mean, really, it's a big statue. You can't, everyone was just like, well, what's that? So, and then she was very, very apologetic. She was just like, look, I don't really know that much about it, and I have to find out. So I was like, look, go on this website, and it'll have everything that you need to know. I mean, she genuinely looked like, she just looked awkward about it, But I think that moment and her reaction to it, that's how it is.
Yeah.
People feel
absolutely.
uncomfortable talking about anything that has to do with blackness, which is very ironic because whiteness is very much premised on blackness.
Yeah, and in Denmark, it's like something like 98% of public monuments are to white men.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It makes,
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, also, I think it's an exciting point of black women in urban space, like thinking of the U.S., in this past summer in New York,
Right.
the Statue of Liberty, that action, and then also we had in South Carolina, like a couple years ago, the pulling of the Confederate flag. So there is something potent brewing,
Right. Well, I mean, one of the things that statue makes me think about is this whole idea, which I write about, the Combahee River Collective, when they talk about the only way that freedom could ever be obtained is actually when black women are free. And for me, what the statue symbolizes is this idea that, black womanhood is the premise of all of this. Because, it's so interesting when Macron talks about that Africa's biggest problem is that African women are having too many kids. If the head of a European country is talking about regular ass black woman and talking about that's the crux of Africa's problem, to me, that's really showing how powerful we are. Because not that I agree that that's the problem. The problem is that whiteness always has to police our bodies and how many children we're having, right? But, I'm just like, okay, our whole economic system is based on the othering, and that othering takes place on a racial scale. And this racial scale determines who are the workers, who get paid a certain amount, who are the experts versus, the regular workers, et cetera, et cetera. So, this black woman, having a statue of this black woman, to me, is like really like, this is what the foundation of Europe is actually on, because Europe's wealth is based on the exploitation of Africa and other, so-called third world or developing nations.
Yeah, and the structural critique of the United States, but the U.S. is a child of the European context, right? So perhaps we could get into the next letter. Thank you for that. It's titled The Forgotten Fathers.
The Forgotten Fathers. Son, we must remember our ancestors. Who came before us? Why are we made to celebrate and commemorate the ancestors of our oppressors, but know not who came before us, our own heroes, those who strove to free themselves from the shackles of slavery, the brunt of indentureship, the oppression of kings and queens. Aside from losing our land, many of us have lost a system of knowledge that has existed even longer than this epoch that has been upon us in what is called modernity. This system of knowledge has been usurped by capital and profit, which have been and continue to be fueled by the spoils of empire and the death project, including its ethnocide. Where is your motherland? What is the land of your mother? What is my land? I was born in Brooklyn. This occurrence equipped me with U.S. citizenship. Any true student of American history must acknowledge the violent roots of this country. It does not take long to understand that the freedom that was heralded by our founding fathers did not include everyone and has always been premised on our subjugation and theft. Even the U.S. Constitution was inspired by the Iroquois or the Haudenosaunee nation's great law of peace. When you were younger, you would often express embarrassment when we would go out, and I would often stop to talk to others. "Do you know them?" you would ask, your brows squinting at me, letting me know of your slight impatience. Once, when you were very young, you asked me, "Mommy, why do black people smile at each other?" It was a fitting enough observation. Whenever we took a walk and we came upon another black person, a smile would often be exchanged. Intuitively, I knew the smiles were of recognition, not only of our presence here, which especially back then was rare, but when you look into the annals of history, when you seek further than the textbooks and narratives insisted upon by the status quo, you learn a lot about your own history. You learn that your history has been buried so that another history could grow up from it, flower from it, and in the end, take all the credit or sun, if we are to continue with this analogy. You learn to attach your own meaning to the blindfolded Moor's head. One of my lifelong contemplations has been the disconnection between me and my ancestry. Identity has always played an integral role in my life through the virtue of my skin color. And then I go in a little bit about identity politics, because it's really like misunderstood when the right talks about identity politics and the left talks about identity politics. And I'm just don't feel like going there right now. Let me skip a little bit. In Trinidad and Tobago, race, class, and social status are very much bound together, as witnessed recently in Anthony Bourdain's Trinidadian episode of Parts Unknown. Did anyone see that? Anyone see this Trinidad? When the late Anthony Bourdain, he went to Trinidad, it was very interesting, yeah. The incident I'm alluding to is when the chairman of the Global Brands Group, Mario Sabga Aboud, who has since apologized, bragged about the impact and success the Syrian Lebanese community in Trinidad has had despite its small size. The comment, seemingly devoid of many historical considerations, could even be viewed as being almost contemptuous to those of us who are the majority and descendants of enslaved Africans and indentured East Indians. It is true that race is a more malleable category in Trinidad and Tobago, but one would be remiss if one were not to acknowledge the seemingly large role it continues to play in terms of power and money. I've always been fascinated by the way we choose to identify ourselves, intuiting early that of all the various ancestries I have coursing through me, it is as a black woman that I identify. When I say black, I mean those of us who have been scattered far from the African continent, representing through our skin a class of people whose exploitation was and is the very foundation and fuel of capitalism. When I say black, I speak to our tenacity for survival and our spirit and the fact that our very existence assures us that our ancestors are still here amongst us. We are our ancestors. When I say black woman, I acknowledge that for a greater part of our modern history, in fact, perhaps the very thing upon which modern history is premised, I was property to be sold, abused without any repercussions to the white ruling class. This was the reality of my ancestors for the slither of time known as modernity. But I know that this brief history is not the only thing to inform my existence, but that if I were to go even further back, before the coming of Europe, there must have been women in my lineage who experienced a freedom that still eludes many of us today. Identity politics does not mean that there is a magical bonding that takes place necessarily between people with common backgrounds. It does mean that there are areas of commonality that we can choose to galvanize ourselves around. in Trinidad, I would learn that anti-blackness can be found among non-whites, like the celebrated writer V.S. Naipaul, rest in peace. I did shed a tear when he cried. He was cantankerous, as Allison reminded me of that word. How many of you know V.S. Naipaul? I mean, he was an asshole, but I liked him. Like the celebrated writer V.S. Naipaul, they have drunk the colonial Kool-Aid. They believe what they were taught by the colonial masters. So although I might exchange a knowing smile with others who look like me here in Denmark, let me be clear and say, it is not everyone who looks like you that will accept you. Again, you will know them by the work that they do. There is no homogenous movement for the liberation of the planet and its people.
Thank you for that. I want to take us on a different thread, the sonic, because it's one of the threads in numerous of your letters that you kind of weave through. You talk about your grandfather's Hammond B3, about your son enrolling in music school, and you tell us about the sonic landscape really richly of Trinidad and Tobago, of the oil industry, and then taking that and turning it into a steel pan, and the soundscapes of all of that. Could you tell us a little bit about how sound informed this work and your work generally, and then also the sonic, how that relates to decolonial thought at all?
Okay. Yeah. So there's this program in Trinidad called Best Village, and are there any Trinidadians in here? Do you know Best Village? Yeah, okay. So Best Village is this cultural program where they would have like these villages and they would compete with each other, and a lot of what they're doing, the dances and the drumming, it's actually it's a continuation from the first enslaved Africans that arrived in Trinidad. So it's an unbroken continuation of a tradition. And I often watch it because it's amazing what these artists do. And one of the things I really love about it is that everyone takes part from the village. Way of verbatim, but they were, the gift that people have for the world. And I'm not strictly abiding by this. I just think it's a great idea because I don't want to get into I'm not racially stereotyping, whatever, but this is something that's really resonated with me, that African brought rhythm, that responsible for the rhythm of the planet. And in terms of what my relationship to music has been is that my father, he was an organist. He played the Hammond B3, which is a serious instrument. If there are any musicians in here, it's not it takes a lot of commitment to have a Hammond because it's like a small little grand piano, and you have to have a speaker, which is like huge, called a Lesley. And so it was a serious piece of equipment, and programming all this stuff. So I grew up with that and thousands of records in my living room. I grew up with music. So when I found that, when I started writing poetry and when I started writing prose, et cetera, that, people would always respond to a rhythm in it. In fact, someone recently contacted me and they were like, oh, you're not a writer, you're actually a composer. That's how the person responded to my work. So, music, I never studied music, but it is something that really informs my work. And as someone coming from, with a heritage, with a lineage that goes back to Africa, also with a lineage that goes back to India, because India also has, all cultures have something, well, most anyway, have something to do with rhythm. And so for me, especially in terms of what I respond to, when you talk about sonics, it's vibration, it's energy, it's scientific. So I just sort of have an intuitive relationship to it. And I think in terms of, decolonial practice, sound is actually like one of the most least studied of the senses. Like there's still, I read somewhere, when a brain cell dies, it actually makes a sound. Well, no, I think when a cell dies, it actually screams.
I cannot confirm that. I don't know. Does anybody?
But,
I don't know.
So, I mean, there's so much going on the sonic level that, we can feel ourselves responding to, but it's not really understood, or that information hasn't really reached our consciousness, et cetera. So I think, as a Black person, and my relationship to, how I respond to sound, and being the child of a musician, and growing up in New York with that whole musical tradition, in Trinidad, I mean, we did, Trinidad claims to have started the steel pan. There are many people contending for that title, many other islands. But we have a very big steel pan tradition. And also, I mean, the whole soca, calypso, and it all goes back to Africa. It's always this tradition that has been modified and cultivated. And so, I think that's something that is... It should be in our consciousness that, there is something vibrationally, and there are many things, but in terms of gifts that, this continent has to give the world. And one of them, I definitely, through my experiential existence, there's something to that.
Yeah. Maybe we talk visual, because we're all senses, right? You write about illustration. And I kind of wanted to connect that with your career in publishing, because you've experienced publishing like online, print, self, all the angles. And you write about the early trips to the Americas. The quote was, you say the illustrator is an arm of PR. And you continue to talk about it in a way that really mirrors the discourses on media today, of representation. And I wanted to hear what you thought of illustration and decolonial thought, and also how, if that, that insight you have on illustration relates at all to your career in publishing.
Actually, I took a course when I was in college called Race and Representation. And that's when I got the vocabulary to understand that, in our society, in the people company, a very, the golden age of hip hop. So, we had some kind of control a lot more control, I think, back then, in a way, in terms of how we were represented, although it was still very much, when you talk about vibe or the source, it's still very much a hip hop within that, framework. But anyway, so for me, it's really, we live in a power structure where, when I talk about the illustrator's role in colonialism, it's just to be clear, it was to present the people, the human beings that were being met in this so-called new frontier, as less than human. Because if you present them as less than human, then people would not have such a difficulty with how you're treating them or taking away their rights, et cetera. The same thing is being done today, of course, with the Middle East, and if you're Muslim, or continued with if you're Asian or Black. I mean, we still see these reproductions going on.
Yeah, convincing of European people that the mission is right, like that process.
And also reaffirming in them, whether consciously or unconsciously, of their superiority. So and also dehumanizing the other, and that is happening very much today, and it goes under the label of free speech, the ability to dehumanize people. And that is the very crux of the whole colonial project. The whole crux of the colonial project was to justify, and this is where race and sexism emerges from, it's to convince people that it's justified to enslave these people, to civilize these people. And again, when we talk about being civilized, to talk about, there's this poet I've been listening to, this Native American poet, and he's passed away, but his name is John Trudell, and he's really amazing. And he actually says this thing about, in terms of Europeans, like Europeans have a very, have no knowledge about what their process of civilization has been like, how brutal, how enmeshed in terror how Europe got civilized, you know, and when I say civilized, I'm not saying it in a way that many people think about it, because when I talk about civilized, I'm talking about the Europeans going to the so-called New World and, you know, genociding people and destroying people and you know, killing babies and raping women and raping the land, and this went on for hundreds and hundreds of years, which is how Europe got rich. So, yeah.
Yeah, and so we're gonna be, Leslie's gonna be reading the last letter, and then have one more question for her, and then we're gonna have a Q&A. So if you guys have like questions simmering, like you hear this knowledge, or if there's something we're not talking about, or something that resonates, keep it in mind, and then I'll pass you the mic at the end. Lesley, please.
Okay, The Conquest of Kyrie, What We Lost in Empire, a reimagining of the history of Trinidad and Tobago. Son, do you know what your name means? The ocean in Hawaiian, food in Maori, forgiveness in Japanese, willow in Navajo, King of Kings in Kono and Kisi, Sierra Leone. I often wonder what it was like back then. What was it like before them? Who were we before them? Why do I speak in the tongue that I do? What did we get for our ancestral sacrifices? Tree-lined boulevards and arches, democratic lies and fascist marches. You know, fascism is a uniquely European phenomenon. You could look it up. They said that their education would liberate me, but all it really did is try to silence me. It took me far away from where I come from. Tell me I am nothing and my people are dumb. 9 Sundays of tobacco smoke blown in my face. 9 Sundays of rum sprayed for pain to be erased. 9 Sundays of candles, beads, and bush bath. 9 Sundays of dreams to break the aftermath. Crack. Crack is the sound that made the whip all the way from Africa in human stuffed. Survival to cover. Crack your community. Crack goes the drug. How I that it is genuine, remembered as one of heroism and genius, and that he is language. In his lifetime, Columbus will manage, like his namesake, the Christ bearer, to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. But he will buckle, dear son. The Christian world is in trouble. Constantinople kneels before no idols, and Prester John must be found. Columbus fails. For instead of finding the mysterious King of East, or be changed. Columbus is a hub of intellect enough to ensure that his crew reaches to Columbus is, who is, and if God so favors the son of a weaver, the side of the people of Kyrie. It is the trinity of violence, disease, and Christianity that these people must now bow to. God does not make man in his image. Man makes God in his image. And if Columbus is a descendant of weavers, tell me, son, what is this tale that he weaves? Columbus is, we are taught, a capable captain. He is wise enough to understand the powers of duplicity. He has, for example, 2 logbooks. One is on public view for the sailors to witness on paper their accomplishments. The other, the authentic one, is hidden in a locked wooden box under the captain's bed. Tell me, son, which one do you think will be remembered? But before I tell you more, what adventures is Columbus involved in before this fateful journey from what is now called Europe to the world that will be new? Columbus spent time in West Africa, played a role in culture and freedom. It is interesting to note that we still call this part of the world that he and his men stumbled upon over 500 years ago the West Indies. It makes me wonder, to the west of whom? The world, after all, is a sphere, and who is to say that it is Europe at her center?
Thank you for that, Lesley-Ann. I wanted to, just reflect on your research process, like how packed your letters are with just, knowledge. For example, the connection you made in, I think it was later in this letter, between Shango, the Yoruba god of thunder, and then Thor, the Nordic god of thunder, all of these rich connections you call the fantastic interconnectedness of humanity, or like a phrase you heard growing up, all of we is one in Trinidad. All of that like interconnectedness. Could you just tell us a bit about your research process of how you compiled all of this information for your son? And for us to hear today.
Yeah, sure. I'm interested in everything. I'm one of these people that just have always been really interested in everything. And again, since I was a child, I set out to understand. This is a combination of others, but to connect things that seem very far from each other. Like she wrote something like that, and that was the first time that I actually had a language to understand the way that my brain was working, but I always see the interconnectedness of everything. Yeah.
Thank you. So that was the last question I had for Lesley-Ann. I would invite you all, if you have questions, can I just like hands, if anybody has questions, I'll come with a microphone. On my way. Maybe over this way. I'm not gonna destroy anything. Great.
Thank you. Hello, Lesley-Ann. Thank you for your reading. My name is Mark. I'm actually from Copenhagen. I grew up there and chose to leave. I live here now. And when I left, it was because I felt so out of place there, and I didn't realize how much of it was about race until I left and had to reflect on it. And then you come to Berlin and you kind of like find community in some kind of way with Black people that are here. I often look at Sweden with a bit of envy. There seems to be some consciousness going on there, some kind of solidarity. And as a person who's lived in Denmark for almost 20 years, a scholar, someone who's also been politically active, now reflecting in your work, like talking to your son, what would you say is kind of like, if not at Denmark, as like not Denmark at large, but specifically Copenhagen with this concentration of the Black population there, what would you think is like the missing link in terms of getting to that kind of like sense of community and solidarity and and kind of like Black community and not just like different immigrant segments kind of?
Thank you. Good question. I think that there is something, I could talk a lot about whiteness. I've studied it for a really long time. Been out in the field in Copenhagen. But anyway, so I think being such a minority as Black people are in a place like Copenhagen, for example, I think if there's not a conscious effort to sort of combat it collectively, ends up doing what whiteness ends up doing what it was designed to do. I mean, whiteness is really toxic for people of color. It's poison. If you're not aware of it and you don't know how to protect yourself. And I think what we have in Copenhagen, first of all, I think things have changed a lot in a good way since I've been there. I've been there for 19 years, and a lot of the younger generation that's coming up, they're really doing stuff. I can't even keep up. It's like they're really getting organized and creating spaces for each other, for healing. I think that's a very important agenda for today. It's that everyone needs to be focused on our individual healing as opposed to our collective healing. So that is going on in Copenhagen. But I do think that living, just like if you're the only black kid in a school or a class, that does something. I don't care what anyone says or if people went through that and they're like, I know there's something about me that was gained because I grew up with mostly black people. And that says, that just really makes a difference in terms about how you feel about yourself, how you feel about others, as opposed to if you grow up in a situation where there are not that many of you. There's this tendency when you're around whiteness, it gets a little bit, because it's really, when we talk about race and we talk about the way that whiteness works in relationship to blackness, it is gaslighting. It's a collective gaslighting that whiteness does. And that, again, if you're not conscious about it and you don't know how to protect yourself from it, it creates the crab in the barrel kind of, and that's what it's designed to do.
Any other questions? No? One? Oh, okay. I actually.
Thank you so much for such a great talk. I'm wondering, as a writer, and you've been living in Copenhagen for so long, publishing in different formats, why, for this book, you decided to address it to your son, about the specific relationship between you and your son, but for public consumption, and just talk a little bit about your son and motherhood.
Yeah, sure. Well, I produced it because I'm an educator, and in 19 years of being in Copenhagen, and also I could say for Europe, Europe has a lot of money, and I'm going to offend some people now, but for such rich countries, the education, like what you guys are learning in college is like, whoa. I'm like, what? So I'm horrified at the deficit in especially around whiteness in terms of history. It's like, a lot of white people feel that, they go to a university and they get an education and they're like, but what is being heralded as education is really a bunch of, BS that's meant to solidify and reproduce a certain power structure. So I was very much appalled by the state of affairs, being there as an educator, and also, what I wasn't aware of, and I'm very sorry for this, is that I really wasn't aware, because there's so many things going on. I really did not become consciously aware that I actually was raising my son in an all-white environment, which was something I didn't have to do, And when I realized, I was like, damn, my baby is having to be around this toxicity every day. So, I wanted to, first of all, it's in line with the tradition. We talked about codes and we talked about Baldwin, and there's even Rilke, letters to a young poet. I love the whole genre of letter writing. Also, my son challenged me because I had written an article, and then he was just like, he wasn't, kids, they don't really, I'm his mommy. He doesn't really look at me as a writer. So he was just like, oh, I'll read the article, but just write me a book and I'll read it. So I wrote him a book. And he's slowly getting through it. And then, so it's, I say, the book is for my son. It's for people who want to, understand the different knowledge, get at least start understanding that there are other knowledge systems outside the one that pretends to be the end-all be-all. And then also for Denmark, because that's the country that I've made my home in for the past 19 years, and I have a lot of problems with it, but it also gave me a space for a certain level of peace. It's been a, I love Denmark. I don't think I want to grow old there, but there are some things about the culture And then, of course, the people that I know there, that's worth celebrating, that's worth cultivating, that's worth continuing, et cetera. So, if you're Danish, I had a situation the other day where this theater group did a play about colonialism for children. And the one black kid in the audience started to cry. And the people who did the theater piece, they were horrified. And then people were like, oh, talk to Lesley, right? So I talked to them and I saw the play, and the play was like really racist. And they didn't mean to be racist. And they were just, and the number one feeling in my conversation with them is that they had a total look of feeling cheated because they didn't learn this in school. Their general attitude was like, I don't believe I'm beeping X years old and I never learned this in school, So, people, whether you identify with whiteness or not, if you're in a situation where, you are part of that historical category of people that has been created for itself, and it's called whiteness, you won't know what it is I'm talking about. But if you want to know what it is I'm talking about, then you have that resource there. And that's also my contribution to helping create a different world for my child, right? And then also the whole motherhood thing, it's like my mom was an immigrant in Brooklyn. So here I am, a different type of immigrant because I'm American, and that has a lot of privilege attached to it, of course. But still, I'm raising my child like 6,000 miles away from my home, and and being in the body that I'm in, and also being there as a woman of color and seeing how like Muslim women are being spoken about or treated about. I mean, it's just, so I really, these are things that I really, as a writer, I feel that I have to speak to, and when I say have to, not in an oppressed way, but I'm happy to actually contribute to that discourse and discussion.
We have one more question back here.
I'm here.
Yeah,
okay.
Go ahead. Yeah.
So a conversation I've been having a lot with my friends of color is when we get together and we talk about maybe how hard it is and the things we're realizing, like the small microaggressions are small, like the microaggressions we face every day. And I find that the conversations get increasingly bitter and is kind of insular. And then we get together and talk about it for like hours on end and then go back into like this whiteness and then keep going. So I wanted to ask how you stop yourself from becoming bitter, because the more you know, the more bitter you become. And then I wanted to follow that up by asking if you engage people in day-to-day life, because I don't. Like if someone says something weird, I walk away or ask a white person to speak to them. But yeah, how do you do that? How do you not become bitter, and then do you engage in day-to-day life?
So I'll answer the last part first. I don't engage anymore. I used to, and it really, and this ties into the first part of your question. Toni Morrison talked about like the role of racism is to rob you of your joy. That is what it does. It really robs you of your joy. You can, end up talking about the evils of, whiteness and Europeans. I mean, there'll never be an end to that discussion. But anyway, that was a joke, guys. So anyway, so that's the trap. That's the trap. Whiteness and blackness was created to justify dehumanizing people. So we, have to, the best resistance is joy. The best resistance is joy, taking care of ourselves, because, the rate of black women dying at childbirth is crazy high all throughout the world, not just in America. The rate for heart attacks among black women is like really off the charts. Diabetes. I mean, we, in terms of our health and how we internalize this, because again, we're talking about the metaphysical here in terms of like you have a system, and the system, it's not written down, but it's structured and it's practiced, and that becomes that becomes materially manifested in our beings and in the structures outside of ourselves. I mean, it's all, this is all very basic, universal law, actually. So, and the other thing about bitterness that I think is important, I was talking to Allison the other day because she made this tea that we drink in Trinidad from this leaf, and it's very bitter. And I went through a period where I was very bitter. And when I remember one day looking back on it and being like, you know what, that's okay too. I mean, don't stay in the bitterness, but drinking, the old people back in our tradition and whatever your lineage is, they drank bitter shit, and they drank it because it was healthy. There is some sort of like, whether it's homeopathic or, there's something to, putting something bitter in your body in terms of getting balance. So I think the bitterness has a purpose, but we have to really realign our lives with joy. Yeah.
Thank you for that. We got a question back here, Lesley-Ann.
Hello, thank you. So I have a little pre-story because the first time I came to Germany, I was 16 and I'm from Tajikistan. And then I was in this German host family. And then they asked me a question and they're like, oh, so you're from Tajikistan and you guys are really proud of being from where you are. And I was like, whoa, that's interesting. I never thought about this because yes, we are. And then, so now you're talking about bitterness. This is what I felt at that moment. And I was like, why I'm not allowed to be proud of what I am? So, and the question is, how do you escape this bitterness? And what piece of advice would you have for people who might feel lost? Because this is what I did back then. And have you had the same or similar experience?
Well, I mean, as soon as you say put a black in front of everything, white people get really offended. Why does it have to be black? So, I mean, I know that one. But, again, it's about joy. It really is finding out. I mean, at the end of the day, no matter what you look like, you have to know what you need to do to keep you joyful, right? You know thyself, right? And that is it, because that's part of the trick with our culture, with Western culture. Part of the trick is that, and what capitalism hinges upon is that we don't feel good about ourselves. We externalize our power. We think the Gucci bag is gonna, whatever. That is. I mean, this is where we're at as a culture. So, and it takes us away. It alienates us from our true selves, from knowing ourselves. Religious externalizes our responsibility. If we're following any of the religions, the responsibility isn't mine, it's in God's hands, right? So, really understanding, and this is also the decolonial part of my title. It's like, there are all these indigenous systems that also existed here in Europe as well. Because what a lot of Europeans I meet don't seem to understand is that these kings and queens who are on your TV, who are marrying actresses, who are doing whatever, I mean, they did some shit back in the day. That's how they got there. It's not, and the power structure is really, is it any different today? I mean, it looks like it's different. But, to me, when you really think about, like, wow, they're kings and, I mean, not maybe here so much, but, like, when you think about England and you think about the whole, historically Europe, I mean, these people who were in power, they got into power by murdering, independent thinking people, by murdering women for hundreds of years, 300-400 years. You're here in Germany, there weren't any women in some villages. You couldn't find any. This is right before the colonial period. This is how they civilized Europe. You had the Inquisition. So you're talking about hundreds of years of torture, hundreds of years of rape, right? And this is in your DNA. This is in whatever it is your ancestors historically experienced. And again, this is science. It's in your DNA. So, it's everyone's responsibility to truly understand where they come from. And I'm not talking about nationalism here, because that's created to further the division, right? So, yeah.
Cool. So we have some questions over there, and then I'll come back on this side. I don't think I can bring the mic up. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for this conference. I'm really thankful. My name is Milagros, and I always answer to people when they ask me, but it's the first question almost, where you come from? And I say that I come from the world like you. They cannot understand. They get mad, terribly mad. Then I start to think what I can say. Then say you come from your mother. Yes. And you say that when I came here. I live in Europe for 24 years. I'm a child from immigrants. I grew up in Italy, grew up in Peru. Then I moved to Finland, and then I came here. Yes, and what I can say from my experience in the school and all this, I got the same treatment in somehow Europe. The racism is so deep. And I just start now, in these last years, to heal myself, to learn what, that I knew that already, because, I don't know, perhaps it's epigenetic or something. Because you know the history from Latin America, the colonizations, Spaniards, and but how, now I go to school here, and I'm learning German, and the first thing that I see in the corridor is the discovery of America. How I can I sue the school, or how? No, really, because I want to make a change, because it's not, they are teaching this, and the 90% from the students that are learning German, they are refugees. And this kind of thinking, you know, now we say that 12th October is the Resistance Day, the Indigenous Day. It's not the discovery of America. So how can I go against this? Because I want to do something. And I try to do all the time, but I get so many enemies, really. But I don't care. My resilience, but it's not easy. So what I can do?
That's a great question and story. Thank you for sharing. I would, there is an organization that's been doing they've been doing a lot of actions recently. They just did it for Indigenous Day, actually. And they're called Decolonize Now. And I think you can find them on Facebook because, you know, I write. I'm not really, you know, I don't know what's going on out there, like on the front lines. Like there are people, I mean, this whole action, I've been following it. It was at a major New York museum. I don't know which one it was, but it was really huge what they were doing. So I mean, there's a tradition there, and there are people out there who are doing it. So I would say, you know, look into that and see what they're doing and connect with them. You know, this is a very important action. We have to continue challenging these spaces. Especially, you know, when if you're in school, and this is what's interesting about it. If you're in a European school, of course that's their narrative, you know, because that is how they reproduce this power structure, yeah. And the reason why it goes unchallenged is because there are a lot of people who have a lot to lose, right? So I would say look into the whole Decolonize Now, see what they've been doing in New York, reach out to them, contact them, and then that way, you know, you'll be in connection with a larger network and also an experienced network. But I definitely encourage you, absolutely, to challenge that and to. I mean, it's violence. It's very, very violent, and that's the so-called innocence of whiteness. You know, it's like it says one thing, but it does another thing, and all that has to be brought down. Yeah.
The thing is that as I go against this kind of thinking, then I got like, how you say, movie, when you are bad treated from the teachers or something. Mobbing, yes. And I have been mobbing, yes. Yeah, bullying from the teacher. I make a Beş complaint, and because the teacher was not only racist for me, but was also misogyny. Okay, and I went to talk to the director. The director say, well, now we are going to talk with the teacher. I want to change class. No, you cannot change. You need to stay here for these 3 weeks. So I try it. Then I can perhaps go to more higher level, to the bump. Yeah, I thought. And but I'm in the position. So this is how it is, the reality, that I'm scared. If I do a letter now, perhaps if I want to apply again to the school, then it will be, I don't.
It's set up that way, and it's not. These institutions weren't designed for you. It wasn't designed for us. And when we go in, I know so many unhappy academics of color. It's really, so it's a gargantuan task. It's very, very big, and you have to have a support system around you. You can't do it alone, and it's difficult. I mean, I don't. You talked about engaging, whatever. Like, I don't engage in spaces like that. I just don't. I mean, I went to the New School for Social Research, which is supposed to be like, this really progressive institution. I took classes called The Blackness of Blackness, and it was so racist. It was really racist. It can't be helped, especially when you're dealing with people who are so unconscious, like really unconscious about their existence, really accepting everything that's been taught to them. Yeah. So you have to, really pace yourself and have a strategy and a community. Yeah.
We have another question over here.
Hi. First of all, I want to tell you thank you so much for your reading tonight. Me and my family basically decided to come here spontaneously. So I had to pick up my daughter from the kindergarten, and then we just spontaneously came, and I absolutely love it. So thank you for your reading. I'm a mom, and my daughter is 5 years old. I'm from Jamaica, actually. I was born in Jamaica, grew up in the Cayman Islands, so Trinidad, I know. And you were talking about Cersei tea, the bitter tea, Cersei. Yeah.
What was it, Allison, we were eating?
Karaili. Okay. But yeah, my question is, as a mother of a black child, raising them in a predominantly white society when you didn't grow up in a predominantly white society, neither did I, how do you kind of navigate through that? I'm also a writer. I write children's books. And to balance work and writing and having to deal with your son, how do you navigate through all of that? Like, what advice can you give me to kind of keep the path and keep going?
I always, writing has just always been something that I do. So I never really felt there were periods of time where I didn't write, but I also think that we have, in our culture, we have this very false narrative in relation to productivity and what that should look like. So if you're a writer, you have to get up at 5 o'clock every morning, write 2 hours, go to work, and if it doesn't look that way, you're not a writer, right? So, I very early on, I interrogated that picture, that very capitalist idea of what being an artist is. So, my writing process is, I've always been writing, and I may not write every day, but I'm writing. And when I'm not writing, I'm also appreciating that it's all about balance, because even when I'm not writing, that gives me the space to sort of think about what it is I've been writing. So I'm still writing, but because writing is a process. It's not just the actual sitting down there and right? So I think, really becoming very conscious around what you need, what you're okay with, not what, how it looks for someone else. And as long as you're producing, and for you, also not on this whole capitalist model of production where, of course, I want to keep a flow, don't get me wrong, but I don't want to get trapped in this idea of like, okay, here's a product and right? So, and then also you have a young child. It's like, that never happens again. It's time, that you'll never get back. So really, it's going to go so fast. 1 minute I brought my baby home from the hospital, now he's 18. So, it's just really, not stressing about it actually, and having I don't know what your relationship is to writing, but I just always felt like very deeply connected to it, that it was very much a part of who I am, no matter what, how many other things I did, it's like, that is a very major part of my engine. So, and for me, writing is like a spiritual practice, right? So engaging with it on that way and just being relaxed about it, because again, if everything in our culture is about stress. Yeah, right. So thank you for bringing your family here. Thanks.
Hello. My name is Daisy. Thank you for being here. So I've been sitting here thinking and absorbing and trying to figure out, I'm like, do I even have a question anymore? So same like you, originally from Trinidad, Brooklyn. Then I lived in Brazil for a bit, Paris, and I've just recently moved here in the past barely 2 months. So I'm learning a lot about living in Europe. And there's all these little minefields, and I've had a lot of different experiences with racism, like living in Brazil. You've got that, you have an American-sounding accent, so then you get the privilege attached to that, and then I feel weird about that. You spoke on these things, so I'm just sitting here nodding, same. So now I'm here, and I'm finding these other minefields, like, okay, so I spend a lot of time with my grandmother because when I'm in Trinidad anyway, I go for a month every year. And, she's 85, so I'm always like, but Ma, how come this and how, but, So, and I'm finding out more about our history, and I'm kind of doing the work to chart our ancestry, and kind of stopped at the great, 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 because that's all we got. And my family's in Laventille, and my grandmother's still up on the hill, yeah. Yes, exactly. So I mean, living in shingles and people walking in the streets and the patong, and it's very bathing in a bucket, like that's my life when I go. So, and then coming here and knowing white Europeans who boast about their ancestry, and that's their right. And then sometimes I'm like, I'm so happy I don't know who my great-great-great-grandmother is, so you can get 7 masters and smoke weed all the time and never actually do anything with all all that work that you've collected. You know those people. And and I struggle sometimes. It doesn't rob me of my joy, but like I said, it's a minefield. I'm walking along, and then, oh, shit, there's a bomb right there, and it's all these new little bits of privilege. Like, it is a privilege that you have a family emblem, and that well. I mean, not really. When you get into the whole thing, it's like, whatever. No, I understand, but you know what I mean, though. So I'm sure you've come across this, and other than maintaining my joy, like, how do you deal with that? Like, how does that make you feel? If ancestry is important to you, which it obviously is, because you wrote a letter to your son. And that's all
the way that I look at it is like, I don't think you have to stop where it goes back to. I think there are other ways of accessing that ancestry. There are many different ways, other realities that exist in this world, I could give you an example. There's a Danish guy who lost his father when he was young, and he went to do an ayahuasca trip, which I talk about. And he met his dad and hung out with his dad. And he walked away from that experience as though he really did. So what's more important, that he had this, reenactment of something that he feels is real, or something that he really felt he needed to do, or that he went and took some ayahuasca and, oh my God, that's illegal, it's drugs, blah, 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 right? So, and especially as indigenous people, or people, the descendants of enslaved Africans, we have so many traditions, we have access to so many different traditions, you have it. It doesn't have to be this square, that's why I mentioned the whole thing about Columbus coming from a language that has no written tradition, because one of the things that, the whole European thing is like, if it's not written down, it's not, and I love books, but there's something, as we're talking about vibration, there's something about the oral tradition, there's so many different ways of reconnecting and finding things out. And so I would suggest to you that it doesn't stop there, at all. And we are, for me, it took me a really long time to have the courage to write this book. And when I got the courage to write the book, it was with the realization that it's actually not about me. It's the fact that we, as oppressed peoples, for every generation, we have people who are born on this planet who are committed to liberation for our people. It doesn't, and we have all many different names, we look different ways, but we're all throughout the planet, and it'll always happen. So, and if one of us, when we fall, others come up. So it's not an ego, individual. I mean, this is an important tradition that this conversation we're having, what I'm hopefully igniting here amongst people. So it's we have to really get out of this very three-dimensional way of thinking, which really enslaves and imprisons our consciousness, because that's what the whole power thing is. It's about taking your consciousness, and that's what we see around us in Europe. It's like people's consciousness it's like they go home, they watch TV in America too, and we get really entrapped in this, what did Trump say, and oh my God, there's all this shit. But if we learn to discipline our consciousness and use it to cultivate something different and outside this matrix, that's where the magic happens. That's where the change happens. That's where liberation can be found, and joy, right?
Cool. So we're going to do 2 more questions, and then we're going to shift to like an informal conversation at the bar, open bar. It's fantastic. So.
Okay, hi. 2 things I wanted to say. The first one was I wanted to say thank you for being here present tonight, but also being in Europe and doing the important work that you're doing, and criticizing everything that you're criticizing, and helping the society change and change and learn in a way. So thanks for doing this emotional labor. The second thing is actually my question. So you were criticizing Naipaul. Just briefly in like brackets. So I was wondering, could you speak a little bit more about your view on Trinidadian literary history, and then also if you do, how you would position yourself in response to this? Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Great questions. Well, the Caribbean has always been known to the powers that be as an area of resistance. There's just like a lot of, the thought, the scholarship, the spirit of rebellion. It's huge from coming out from the Caribbean. You talk about Stokely Carmichael, who was with the Black Panther. You talk about C.L.R. James. You talk about Eric Williams, who was like his thesis back in the day. It was totally tying slavery to capitalism. So, there's this tradition there that I was always made aware of, because, I came from a family that had access to people who read, because not everyone in my family read, but I had access to a couple of, people, my grandfather and my uncle, and they had a lot of books, and, and they had a lot of Trinidadian and Caribbean, other Caribbean writers, et cetera. So I, the advantage of being born Trinidadian, for me, was actually having access to that legacy. And what was the other part of your question?
How you position yourself, or also how you criticism of Naipaul, B.S. Naipaul.
Okay, yeah. Well, Naipaul, I first read Naipaul when I was about maybe 14 or 15, maybe a little younger, in Trinidad. And I read his novel called A House for Mr. Biswas, and it just totally blew my mind. It was, I was like, his writing is just really... I don't agree at all with what, like his interpretations, because he is very colonial. I understand that mentality, because I grew up with a lot of people in Trinidad of a certain generation who were really programmed to think about Europe and England as the end-all, be-all. They were, they strove to be gentlemen. They were, highly, if you, back in the day, I don't know what it's like now, but you go in a Caribbean, you go in a rum shop and you hear the most eloquent, right, Allison? You'll hear the most eloquent speech. My grandfather quoted Shakespeare all the time, it was just very strange, So, yeah, that's, so, I don't, so Naipaul was someone that I just loved him like he was my grouchy, uncle or something. But I also, like he just recently died, and I really cried, I was really, and that's kind of messed up, like because he's such a sexist, and he's such a, and I think we all need to have this conversation with ourselves, and I'm having it with myself, where do you separate the art from the artist? That's constantly coming up. Like I was in Oslo for the Oslo International Poetry Festival, and they did this. They decided to do this part of the festival in tribute to Knut Hamsun, who was a Nazi. And that was and that was the whole thing. So and then they had this whole segment for black poetry. There was even a Jewish poet there. I mean, and then at the same time, you have this tribute to Knut Hamsun, who is a brilliant writer. I mean, there's some things, that he wrote or whatever. But, so, that's another whole area, right? Like, what do you, do you watch Woody Allen films? It's, but it's conversations that I think that are worth having with yourself, because it never ends, because we're all human. And we live in a society, when we talk about, whether you're a Nazi, that's normalized. I mean, we are living, Denmark, Scandinavia, they are white supremacist states. They just don't come out and say it. And that is the dangerous thing about whiteness, is that, most white people aren't aware of how it works, how it functions. And in that ignorance, it's allowed to just keep on going,
I was just wondering because it took me a while to find these spaces, and now I found them, I'm kind of fine. Because when people say to me, where are you from? I say I'm from Sweden because my furniture's from there. I'm not from Sweden, I'm from Britain. And it doesn't bother me that my way I look is a threat because I am anti-national, so I'm glad that my identity is a threat to your understanding of the nation. But I wonder what we do for the people that do not come into these spaces and do not come across these spaces, because I sometimes talk with these people and I cannot offer them this ideology in a breakdown conversation of 10 minutes. And it takes a while to grow into these academic discourses. And I just wonder for those people what can be offered. For their experience of the everyday kind of microaggressions and the struggles of race, and I have ways of dealing with it that come from my academia and my ideologies. But if you don't have that and you don't recognize the system for what it is.
I think that I would venture to say that most black people understand what all the fuckery is about. We know, right? And I think that the most important thing is actually community, and a lot of people find that community, in our historical context, have found that community in church. A lot of people find it in culture and whatever, but I mean, it has to come through your community. You can't do it on your own. You can't be isolated. You have to, really, I talk about that in my book, this whole idea of meeting places, of, finding people who you connect with around certain issues and cultivating that. Just like if you have a piece of land and you're like, oh, I'm gonna grow a tomato plant here. You can be like that when you meet people. You can be like, oh, I like to talk to so-and-so about, current events, or I like to talk to so-and-so about literature or blah, blah, and really being aware of it. I mean, awake about it. Because a lot of us, we socialize and there's no purpose behind it. Maybe it's networking so you can see how far you can go ahead or whatever. But beyond that, just really understanding that when you're meeting people, that you're being very intentional around that you're meeting, around that you're meeting, yeah.
So thank you, everybody. So we're going to be moving to the bar. If you're feeling like heading out, I ask that you use these window door things. And let's just give Lesley-Ann a round of applause for her time and energy and love. To the bar.